Hi again, I'm John D'Amico, and this is Frank Borzagi's 1932 film, A Farewell to Arms, based on the 1929 novel by Ernest Hemingway. That novel was Hemingway's second, and this film is Borzagi's about his 139th film as director. Hemingway was 33 years old at the time of this film. He would have been 29 in 1929 when he published his novel. Frank Borzage at this time was 38, both sort of in the middle of long, complicated careers. Both filmmaker and writer suffered as the style changed. They both sort of peaked in this late 20s, early 30s modernist era, and then their careers really were, in both cases, on a slide from this high. This film represents about the high water mark of both of them, with the exception of some ups and downs, most notably The Old Man and the Sea in 1952 and Borzagi's late career masterpiece Moonrise in 1948. And they're an odd couple. Hemingway, of course, is known for his troubled masculinity. Borzage, on the other hand, focused on swooning romances. And he was not the first choice to direct. That was John Cromwell, who left. And when he left, the original choice of star, Frederick March, left with him. So here we have Borzage and March's replacement, Gary Cooper, who was at the beginning of his career. Hemingway did not like this film at all. He thought the ending destroyed his novel. He thought it was far too sentimental, far too romantic a film for the story he was trying to tell. And he probably is right. This is not the story he's trying to tell. Here's our star Gary Cooper as Frederick Henry, who we can see is already inured to the war. This repose in the middle of danger attitude he has reminds me a lot of Indiana Jones. I think it's a nice character introduction. Hemingway's novel was a semi-autobiographical work about an ambulance driver, an American ambulance driver in World War I who's injured and falls in love with a nurse, and in the end it doesn't work out. And that was... the skeleton of that is a true story. Ernest Hemingway, when he was 19 years old, he was an ambulance driver for the Italian army in World War I, and he was injured, and he wound up in a hospital where he fell in love with this woman named Agnes von Kurowski. Her uncle, incidentally, designed the Gage Building in Chicago. She was an American from Pennsylvania. The two fell in love, and it just didn't work out. It was a wartime romance, but that haunted him. And much of his writing addresses her. She comes up even in the 50s, which was near the end of Hemingway's life. She makes a few appearances veiled in his works throughout his whole life. This wasn't the first time he was handling this story. In Our Time, which was his first major breakthrough, a short story collection, he has a story about an injured soldier and a nurse, and it's much, much more bitter than this. It's they fall in love, it goes to hell for no reason, and the young man gets syphilis, and that's the end of the story. Hemingway bore the scars of being jilted by Agnes Kurowski for a long time. Borzage, on the other hand, had his own story. Frank Borzage was married since 1916 to a woman named Rena Rogers, who is very much the prototypical Frank Borzage heroine. The women in his films, even Helen Hayes in this film, all kind of look like her, actually. And the men, including Gary Cooper, all kind of look like him. She was a strong, smart, capable woman, and from the beginning it was understood between them that she did not love him the way he loved her. And he spent his life trying to understand and reconcile that. So what we have here is, I think, a film from two great artists at the top of their game who are working completely different sides of the street and completely different styles, and who meet here in this sort of cataclysm of their two real-life love affairs. So it's a really interesting film. It's unique. It has stylistic touches you don't see anywhere, and there's sort of idiosyncrasies, and there's a tension between the two stories being told at once in it, which I think is always really fascinating and worth holding on to. Like I said, this wasn't the first time Hemingway wrote about something like this, and it also wasn't the first time Frank Borzage directed something like this. His big hits were Seventh Heaven in 1927 and Lucky Star in 1929, both of which were about soldiers returning from World War I, falling in love with younger women, and trying to come to terms with the war. Lucky Star, in particular, was close to this because it was about a man who was injured in the leg as well, and the troubles in his relationship. Farewell to Arms was very controversial when it came out. The book was banned in Boston in 1929, and the film, this script was immediately, even before the film was in production, the script was in trouble because the end here, when we're dealing with Catherine Barclay's childbirth, there were details, there were anatomical descriptions of her labor pain and the hemorrhaging, and there were medical descriptions that were unacceptable and had to be taken out, or the film wouldn't have gotten approved. It was banned in Australia and I think British Columbia as well as the Hemingway book. Borzagi's earlier films, The River in 1929, similarly faced cuts for male nudity. It was a very erotic film. It was a romance, and in typical Borzage fashion, it sort of flipped the gender roles around. There's a scene where a man is swimming around in his swimming hole naked, and he realizes that the love interest, this woman, is watching him on the edge. And it's very similar to a lot of scenes in a lot of movies, including that swimming sequence in Forbidden Planet, except, of course, the gender roles are reversed, which is that kind of Frank Borzage approach to women that is crucial to this film's success. Gary Cooper, incidentally, was no stranger to controversy either. He, in 1929, went fully nude in the film Wolf Song, which I'm sure half of you are Googling right now. He was rumored to have slept with nearly all of his co-stars. Helen Hayes, who plays against him here, admitted to a very serious crush on him at the time. Tallulah Bankhead, the actress, once said that, quote, "I came to Hollywood to fuck that divine Gary Cooper," end quote. So, of course, Hemingway loved him. Hemingway hated this film, but he loved Gary Cooper. Cooper was exactly the man Hemingway wanted to be. Hemingway, he had trouble with what he did in the war. He served very well, and he served bravely, but he felt it was never enough. He came home and he sort of lied about it. He claimed that he was personally decorated by the King of Italy. He claimed that he was instrumental in the war, which he wasn't. Later, he returned to the Spanish Civil War, where he was instrumental, and he sort of chased around World War II as well as a journalist, and there he got in a lot of trouble for leading a French Foreign Legion squad, which was sort of the silly, desperate thing an old man like him did when he was so desperate for glory. Most literary men have a bit of a falling out with Hemingway when they get older and they realize the way his masculinity hid deep pools of insecurity. But when you know that and you kind of come to terms with that, it becomes another layer in his work, that insecurity. And there's a great deal of that here. So Gary Cooper, who was not the first pick for this, ends up being the perfect pick for this because he was the ideal Hemingway hero. On the other hand, Helen Hayes, the heroine in this film, is sort of the ultimate Frank Borzage woman. She's a very accomplished, very smart actress. There's a theater named after her, the Helen Hayes Theater on 44th Street. She got what Tracy Morgan called an EGOT, an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony. She knows how to play this character, which I believe is the single worst character in any of Hemingway's major works. Catherine Barclay on the page she's morose, she's weird, she seems to have no inner life of any kind. She's just kind of this cipher for the men to bounce off of. But Frank Borzage, he knew women. The tagline for this film, in fact, was "Every woman who has loved will understand." He was a woman's director. There are moments that come later where lines that should not work in the text work very well because of Hayes' intuition and Borzage's intuition, which is to treat her more swooning moments as a sign not of codependency, but as sort of frivolous passing frustration. That's Adolphe Menjou as Rinaldi talking right now. In World War I, he actually was the captain of an ambulance corps based out of the real-life hospital in Genoa that this one is written after. Later on in the 1940s, he sold Charlie Chaplin out to the House Un-American Activities Committee.
The Austrians to win the war. Oh, no, it is not true. But you don't want us to attack.
This priest character here is a much larger role in the novel. He's kind of a pathetic figure at first, who's always picked on by everybody else, until near the end of the novel, as people's approach to the war changes, you realize that his quietness was actually the greatest source of strength in the unit. In this film, he's virtually cut out. He appears, I think, in 2 more scenes, and it's kind of an example of Borzage's willingness to just strip this story down to its core. The novel is really 2 stories. It's the story of this unit and the story of this romance. Borzage has no interest in the story of this unit. Rinaldi, Adolphe Menjou's character, stays in the picture quite a bit, but not really as a doctor. You never see him at work. He's an accomplice for Gary Cooper. This is a war movie in setting, but not a war movie in practice. The only death in this film of substance is Catherine's death, and that is a death in childbirth. That could happen. That could be the streets of Paris, which was the setting of Borzage's first movie about World War I, Seventh Heaven, which still remains his most popular film. It was the 13th highest grossing silent film ever made. So this world of young people in love with a war going on behind them is familiar to Borzage. It's the source of his greatest successes in his whole career. So in that way, he's a more natural fit for this story than viewers now, or even Hemingway himself, might have expected. Compare him to David O. Selznick, who's a much more traditional war film director and a much more traditional literary film director, and who also adapted this novel in 1957. And his version is atrocious. It's garbage. It's over twice the length of this one, and it's a death march. It has no character. It has no ambition beyond being an exact duplicate of the novel. This was intentional for Selznick. He believed, he had this theory that was what it meant to adapt a work. He got in a big fight with Alfred Hitchcock about this when Hitchcock was adapting Rebecca for him. And he put out a memo to Hitchcock that sort of acts as the Selznick manifesto for how to adapt a work. He says that a film, narrative or dramatic, will succeed in the same manner as the original succeeded if only the same elements are captured and if only as much as possible is retained of the original, including alleged faults of dramatic construction. There's a moment at the end of the novel where Frederick Henry is standing over the dead body of Catherine Barclay saying his goodbyes, and he says in narration, it was like saying goodbye to a statue. Now, in this Borzage film, there's a lot of controversy about the ending, and we'll get to that, but it is Borzage's ending. Selznick takes this line about saying goodbye to a statue, and he puts it in the dialogue in the mouth of Rock Hudson, and it's this clunky, purple, wrong little moment. It's aesthetically wrong, it's thematically wrong, where Rock Hudson is crying and he says, "Oh, you're so cold, you're like a statue." He sounds stupid. It's a stupid thing to say. But it was the Selznick school. And it's, I think, a big part of why the phrase, "the book was better," is such a tenet of American cinema. There's this tradition of adaptation, which the films usually open with a close-up of the cover of the book being opened, and then there's this promise that it will retain as much of the original as possible, and then they hammer it into the same goofy star piece that they hammered all of them into. But this film is not of that tradition. And just as Selznick always threw in as much as possible, it seems like Borzagi's approach was to find the core of the story and eliminate as much as possible around it. He speaks in interviews of tenderness, simplicity, and little human touches as the essentials of making a film, which to me is very similar to the Hemingway philosophy, which he spoke about in his autobiography, A Movable Feast, that the trick to writing was merely to write one true sentence, the truest sentence possible. So there's this aesthetic approach to art that both of these men have, where what they want is a small, true moment. And yet their styles couldn't be more different. What was a true moment to both of them is it's polar opposites. Because Frank Borzage was working through his issues with his wife the same way Hemingway was working through the issues with his lover in this text. I believe that this version is part Borzage, part Hemingway, and it's a hybrid therapy session where they're both sorting out their problems with women and what that means for them as men. And that, of course, leads us to this scene right here, which is sort of the nexus of the entire film. Catherine's death is explicitly in the text and implicitly in this a sort of cosmic punishment for this evening. There's a kind of refrain throughout the novel, throughout the film, and throughout the criticism of the film about how they wish they were married, and how there's a moment in the film where the priest gives them a quick informal wedding ceremony when he's in the hospital, and this is a response to a line in the novel where Catherine says that she considers their first night together in the hospital their wedding night. But it wasn't, and it wasn't in the film either. It's a bandage placed over the morality of the time. Now, this film is remembered and marketed as a deeply romantic film, and on a level it is, but this is an incredibly dark, mistake-driven scene, which sparks their romance. It reads now as a rape. I don't think it was intended that way. I think there was sort of more of a sense of what she was saying earlier about the shame of the nurse's night off element of it. But of course, that's less of a concern now. So now this hesitation reads as rape. And it's the first moment where Borzagi's impeccable eye for women and how they feel and how their minds work butts against Hemingway's blatant anger and competition with women. It's a surprisingly unromantic and in a way frightening beginning, which colors the rest of the story. And even though it's trotted out as one of the great romances, and in a way it is, it's a romance. Actually, Hemingway nailed it himself. He once said that this was his Romeo and Juliet, and he was right in as much as it's a story which inherently, implicitly, and irreducibly ties love and death together. It's been suggested that the arms of the title are not a reference to war, but to Catherine. They're her arms, which he says farewell to at the end of the story. that's a little reductive, but in the end, in the novel, and particularly in the film, the greater struggle is the struggle two young people have with reconciling their feelings towards one another with the larger world than with surviving battle.
Why not?
Which is why
There's a war on.
struggle and death comes really once they've escaped the war and go to Switzerland.
What did you say your name was?
And in fact, Catherine seems to know in this scene what this means for her. As a woman, I guess, should, particularly in this era, with its strong, lingeringly Victorian morality and its lack of sympathy and contraceptive support for women. World War I, it's said, destroyed Victorianism, and this film is sort of a literalization of that. You watch the old morality come crushing up against the face of death, and this new, almost proto-hippie morality grows out of it, which really in the end is the story of every generation that fights a major war. It happened in Russia after their battles with Napoleon. It happened in America, of course, in the Civil War, and again in Vietnam. And it happened here in World War I. Now, if you watch this movie at any time between 1937 or 1999, there's a good chance you never saw the end of that scene. Everything after the moment where Catherine says, "I would like to kiss you," and they kiss, was taken out of the film in a 1938 re-release.
Was she nice to you, practically speaking? Shut up. I am a man of extreme delicacy, but was she...
In 1932, when this film was originally released, the Hays Production Code was not in effect, though it still had censorship trouble even in that more liberal time. By 1938, the code was in effect, and a full 11 minutes were taken out of this, including the steamier part of that centerpiece romance, as well as this brief scene coming up between Nurse Ferguson and Catherine where they talk about what happened. And it's a big shame that one's gone, because it's some of Hayes' best acting in the film. You can see in her eyes this sort of fear, realizing what she's into. She realizes, in love. And she phrases that in this terrific way. "I think I am," with this look, where it's played almost as, "I think I am ill." It could be. Here it is. It's short, so I'll just be quiet and let you experience it.
A lot of geese, that's what you are. Silly geese, stuffed with bunk about woman's part in the war. We must bring solace to the men who fight, sacrifice ourselves, give ourselves. If you'd known him for a long time, or been in love with him, but you only met him tonight.
How long must you know a man before you can love him?
Are you pretending to be in love with that man?
I think I am, Fergie. I must be. Or it couldn't have happened.
You're just another conquest to him. 1 in 100. You'll probably never see him again.
He said if he'd met me back home, he'd have courted me, sent me flowers. But now, I suppose I won't ever see him again.
The novel, which was entirely from his point of view, does not have any moment like this for Catherine. Borzage gives us a few. That was cut 2. And there are rumors that in the 1938 release, at the end, Catherine Barclay does not die. She appears to die and comes back, which renders the entire rest of the film pretty meaningless. But I've never been able to find that version. Apparently that was the version Hemingway was aware of, because it was shot in 32 and not used until 38. The 38 release really butchered this film, and I think is a big part of why it's not quite as firmly placed in the canon as it should be. Along with that, it slipped into the public domain when the Paramount archive was sold to Warner Brothers, which is why actually some versions of this you'll see, instead of this long opening credit sequence with the bombs bursting, you'll see a shorter opening credit sequence with the Warner Brothers logo instead of Paramount. They bought the rights from this as well as a bunch of other Paramount movies. When this happened, for reasons that I'm still pretty fuzzy on, the rights failed to be renewed in 1960, so ever since 1960 this film has been public property and nobody's made any money off of it. And the public domain is a great thing. It gives us access to a lot of material that we otherwise wouldn't, but the danger of it is it means nobody has any financial incentive to curate or take care of any of these films. Warner Brothers does the best job of any of the studios at taking care of their film heritage, and this film has recently been restored, but there was a long time there where this was in terrible shape, chopped up and blurry, and basically all the charm had been burnt out of it. So it's a minor miracle that we have this film back the way it was, and we've really only had it like this for 14 years. So its status, and this is a challenge for Borzagi's work on the whole, its status is sort of creeping back up after a long absence in the film community. So between the 50s and the 70s, once they bought the rights, the movie was virtually lost. There were battered 16mm cut prints and bootlegs, and that was really it. And it's a shame when the condition of this film deteriorates, because as you can see, the lighting and the cinematography is so much a part of its charm. Charles Lang, the director of photography, won Best Cinematography at the 1932 Academy Awards. It also won Best Sound, which is an element that's going to come up in a little bit when Henry goes to the front. It was nominated for Best Art Direction and Best Picture, and in both cases it lost to Cavalcade, which is very much the inferior film. Charles Lang's work on this film, his camera work, is among the most important single film contribution any cinematographer has ever had. He invented in this film what's known now as Paramount, because of the studio, or butterfly lighting. It's a glamorous lighting setup which strikes people immediately as a giveaway of classic Hollywood. This is a great example of it right here in this scene, and one of the first times this lighting setup was ever used on a feature film. The idea is you hold a key light over the camera, spilling all your light on the forehead and cheeks. It leaves this little shadow under the nose, which kind of looks like a butterfly, and that's the source of the name. Sin City uses butterfly lighting a lot, so does just about every portrait you've ever seen of Marlene Dietrich. And it was very popular in the French New Wave. Breathless, the Godard film, nearly every time Jean Seberg is on screen, she's shot with this lighting scheme. Incidentally, the only reason we have this complete version is because David O. Selznick, who I was ragging on earlier, saved a copy. So as much as I hate his version of this film, we do have to give him credit for being able to see this. Now we're about to get into the first of two battle scenes in this film. Borzage, who was the ultimate humanist in American film, absolutely hated battle, and he refused to shoot combat. In both this and his earlier film, Seventh Heaven, they're shot by other directors. In Seventh Heaven, these battle scenes were shot by John Ford, who was working at Fox at the same time Borzage was working at Fox. It's important, I think, to know the studios that these late silent, early sound films come out of, because unlike today, there was a very strong sense of flavor between them. Paramount, which this is a product of, was a star-based one. They cared quite a bit about who was in the movie. Fox, until the end of the silent era, was the only director-based system until the New Hollywood years in the 1960s and 70s. William Fox, the president of the company, hired F.W. Murnau, the great German director, in the early 1920s, and all of the American Fox directors, from John Ford to Howard Hawks to Frank Borzage, all learned from him, and all their films until about the mid-30s, all carry that fog-shrouded, expressionist look that Murnau developed. So Ford's work in Seventh Heaven actually fits right into the rest of the film, because it's coming from the same post-Murnau tradition. Later, in 1935, Ford and Borzage were among the 12 filmmakers who formed the Screen Directors Guild. In this film, in A Farewell to Arms, these two battle sequences are shot by the Romanian director Jean Negulescu, who was the second unit filmmaker. That explosion right there, that weird, almost electric clipping when it hit, you can hear that sort of sound a lot in early 1930s war films. It comes up in All Quiet on the Western Front and in Pabst's West Front 1918. These films were sort of in uncharted waters trying to capture the soundscape of a war. The visual elements, the fire and the smoke and the fog, I mean, that had all been... There was already a long legacy going back even to Goya of capturing that, but the audio, the sound of an explosion was something that it seems like it took maybe until Kubrick, maybe until Paths of Glory to really capture the fidelity and the scale of an explosion. These explosions, they sound small. And I imagine on one hand that's the result of the equipment, but on another hand, nobody had tried any of this before. There was no real right or wrong way established.
How do you feel, baby?
So there's something sort of experimental about these early sound war films. They all have this sort of eerie deadness to them that you don't encounter anywhere else.
I can take you and never hurt you. You must forgive me, baby, for talking so much, but I'm very moved to see you badly wounded. How did it happen? I will see you are decorated for bravery. Perhaps we can get you the Medaglia d'Argento, but surely the bronze one. Did you carry somebody on your back?
I didn't carry anybody. I couldn't move.
Surely there was something heroic. Tell me what you did.
I was blown up, eating cheese.
Now we're back with Rinaldi, and that reminds me of something I want to talk about.
Don't worry, baby. I will fix you so that you are as...
The name Rinaldi comes up first, before In a Farewell to Arms, in Our Time, which is the short story collection that I mentioned, which included the story that was Hemingway's first attempt at writing about Agnes von Kurowski. The character Rinaldi, I don't think it's the same character. Rinaldi in Our Time is critically wounded in the middle of a battle against the Austrians. But there's another story in it which is of critical importance to understanding A Farewell to Arms and where it came from. It gets a little tricky, so I'll try to keep it simple. In Our Time has a complicated publication history. It was the first thing Hemingway published after he had lost all of his manuscripts at a train station when they were stolen out, when his luggage was stolen. This material was first published in 1924 in a 38-page Parisian press of 300 copies, 130 of which were unusable. This 1924 edition is a series of short, usually 1 to 2 paragraph long vignettes about bullfighting and World War I. The next year, in 1925, this material was picked up by Scribner's in a full U.S. edition. And what they did was they took these 38 pages, these short stories,
Why do you stop?
and used them as interstitial chapters, webbing together
They're in my coat.
a series of longer stories Hemingway had written in the intervening year. This was what they did with the paragraph about Rinaldi, and this is what they did about the bullfighting bit. But there was one of these, the longest of the short stories in the 1924 edition. They gave a title and put it as an actual standalone short story in the 25 edition. And this is the story about Agnes von Kurowski, whose name here is changed to Luce. 1925 was a big year for Hemingway. It was the year he met F. Scott Fitzgerald, a friendship and rivalry that colored the rest of his life. It was the year Frank Borzage released Lazy Bones, his first film for Fox, and his first time under the influence of F.W. Murnau. And in political terms, and in the terms of Europe struggling with the wars, this was the year Mein Kampf was released. It's pretty short, and it seems to me crucial to understanding this film and this novel, so I'd like to read this story in full for you right now. Once again, it's called A Very Short Story. One hot evening in Padua, they carried him up onto the roof, and he could look out over the top of the town. There were chimney swifts in the sky. After a while, it got dark, and the searchlights came out. The others went down and took the bottles with them. He and Luce could hear them below on the balcony. Luce sat on the bed. She was cool and fresh in the hot night. Luce stayed on night duty for 3 months. They were glad to let her. When they operated on him, she prepared for the operating table, and they had a joke about friend or enema. He went under the anesthetic, holding tight onto himself so he would not blab about anything during the silly, talky time. After he got on crutches, he used to take the temperature so Luce would not have to get up from the bed. There were only a few patients, and they all knew about it. They all liked Luce. As he walked back along the halls, he thought of Luce in his bed. Before he went to the front, they went into the Duomo and prayed. It was dim and quiet, and there were other people praying. They wanted to get married, but there was not enough time for the banns, and neither of them had birth certificates. They felt as though they were married, but they wanted everyone to know about it and to make it so they could not lose it. Luce wrote him many letters that he never got until after the armistice. 15 came in a bunch to the front, and he sorted them by dates and read them all straight through. They were all about the hospital, and how much she loved him, and how it was impossible to get along without him, and how terrible it was missing him at night. After the armistice, they agreed he should go home to get a job so they might be married. Luce would not come home until he had a good job and could come to New York to meet her. It was understood that he would not drink, and he did not want to see his friends or anyone in the States, only to get a job and be married. On the train from Padua to Milan, they quarreled about her not being willing to come home at once. When they had to say goodbye in the station at Milan, they kissed goodbye but were not finished with the quarrel. He felt sick about saying goodbye like that. He went to America on a boat from Genoa. Luce went back to the Pordenone to open a hospital. It was lonely and rainy there, and there was a battalion of Arditi quartered in the town. Living in the muddy, rainy town in the winter, the major of the battalion made love to Luce, and she had never known Italians before, and finally wrote to the States that theirs had only been a boy and girl affair. She was sorry, and she knew he would probably not be able to understand, but might someday forgive her and be grateful to her, and she expected, absolutely unexpectedly, to be married in the spring. She loved him as always, but she realized now it was only a boy and girl love. She hoped he would have a great career and believed in him absolutely. She knew it was for the best. The major did not marry her in the spring or any other time. Luce never got an answer to the letter to Chicago about it. A short time after, he contracted gonorrhea from a salesgirl in a Loop department store while riding in a taxicab through Lincoln Park. From this, you can see already, within the half-decade between this story and Farewell to Arms, a softening in Hemingway's approach to what happened with Agnes Kurowski. This story was savaged by critics. They said it was the worst in the collection and it was nothing but pure bitterness. I'm not so sure about that. I think, as Hemingway himself maintained, that it was sort of a metaphor for the way the war went. You started out with these high, elegant hopes, and in the end it crashes down in the most tawdry, banal way imaginable. And this opening image of a hot evening in Padua looking out over the city is very similar to how Borzagi's film Seventh Heaven opens, with this classic skyline drifting over Paris, this dreamy European skyline. And of course there are moments that wind up in Farewell to Arm, the talk about the silly talky time and worrying he would not blab. That's something that comes up with Catherine. She worries about the same thing as she's lying in the hospital at the end of the story. And the letters that he never gets until after the armistice, the content of them, how much she loved him, how much it was impossible to get along with him, and how terrible it was missing him. Remember that, because there's a scene in this film which is not present in the novel, in which Catherine is writing Frederick a letter. And it feels to me that it's a version of this scene, this incident being described here, which is obviously a common wartime incident, but the character of it is very much along the same lines. The scene here with the priest isn't present in the novel quite in this form. He never marries them in the novel. And it's sort of a concession to the 1932 censors, but in 1938, the whole end of the scene where he says, of course, this was silly, it's not official, I wish I could really marry you, that's all taken out. And it ends with the ceremony and with a close-up that's not present in this version of the two wedding rings to assure you that, yes, this was an official marriage, because they're going to bed right after it. And in 38 in the Hays Code, they could not do that without a disclaimer assuring you that they were really married, which everyone else who ever saw a version of this knows they're not. This depiction of a boy and girl love is what Ferguson was warning Catherine about in that other earlier scene that's not in the novel. And it's an interesting question, because this romance doesn't have time to sour the way Luce's did. They speak of true love, and they speak of an impossibility to live without one another. But it's something that lingers with me every time I watch this or read this, the idea that maybe this romance would not have worked out. It seems built on too sure and too quick a foundation for that. Borzage kind of works around that. He puts some lightness into it that's not present in the novel. And Hemingway was never good at showing people falling in love. They met each other and love happened. And it happened because it had to. Borzage was uncommonly good at showing people fall in love. You can see that in that long courting scene. They bicker. And in bickering, they come to settle in with one another.
It's the opera I made my debut in.
But
Scala. They threw benches at it.
But even so,
Yes, they did. I threw 6
the questions this story
That's not
raises
funny.
linger over the
Oh, no, he's offended.
He'll get over it. That's his sore spot.
linger over
You don't care whom you hurt.
over a farewell to arms. And if we take as has been suggested that the arms of the title are Catherine's,
Oh, we never fight.
what would happen if he didn't have to say goodbye to her?
Fight or die. That's what
Would they go to England? Would they go to America? Would they stay in Switzerland? Would they move back to Italy?
I'm not crying.
This child they have, what would happen with the child? As Catherine lays in the hospital at the end of the film,
Won't get her into trouble.
You better not.
Frederick says, "It's okay that you took the child, just leave me her."
What is the matter with her?
Frank Borzage was haunted at this time by his wife's abortion. He loved children and he died to have them, and his wife, who did not love him the way he loved her, though she respected him and his work, had an abortion. So pay attention to the end.
Darling.
Pay attention to this goodbye between them, because it does seem
How many, really?
too much. It seems like it burns itself out, that once the passion had been gone,
None.
You're lying to me.
this romance might not have ended
Oh, that's right.
as elegantly.
Right on lying. That's what I want you to do. Were they pretty?
Feel free to disagree with me about that, but that's just the way I've always taken it. This scene here is one of the great examples of the difference in tone between the book and the film, and I'm not sure anybody but Helen Hayes could have pulled this off. In the novel, this dialogue is virtually identical in the novel, but it comes off differently. Catherine feels younger and insecure and weird. She's there's this sort of clumsy, childlike need for approval that Hayes and Borzage kind of turn around, and they turn it into an accusation, and instead of it being about her insecurity, she's prodding him, challenging his insecurity. And Cooper has got this great, almost Cary Grant deadpan through this scene. It's something that doesn't come off funny on the page, and it took a really limber crew to pull that off. And that ability is why this version feels so light on its feet in the face of, say, the Selznick version, which is tired, or even a lot of other adaptations of Hemingway's stuff, like The Snows of Kilimanjaro, or For Whom the Bell Tolls. They all sort of fall under the weight of the words. The only other Hemingway adaptations I can think of that are of this caliber are a 1977 short film version of A Soldier's Home, which creates all the dialogue from the ground up because there's virtually none present in the story, and To Have and Have Not, which is sort of another ground up rewriting of Hemingway's concept. That one's a really funny one, actually. Howard Hawks made it on a bet with Hemingway that he could make something out of his worst novel. So he picked To Have and To Have Not, and then he had as screenwriter Hemingway's big rival William Faulkner, who also to this day filmmakers have trouble adapting because of the weight and peculiar design of his dialogue. To Have and Have Not is virtually unrecognizable when held against the book, which, to be honest, I think is actually one of Hemingway's better works, but I seem to be pretty much alone in that. Now, for everything I just said about how nobody but Helen Hayes could play this part, like everyone else involved in this film, she was not the first pick. Paramount knew they wanted to do Farewell for Arms for years, and they tested a lot of people. Before her, Ruth Chatterton, Claudette Colbert, and Eleanor Boardman were seriously considered to play Catherine Barclay. Boardman shot some scenes which exist now in a 1931 promotional film Paramount released called The House That Shadows Built, which also features the only surviving footage of Lon Chaney in the film The Miracle Man, the unfinished Dorothy Arzner film Stepdaughters of War, and footage from an act the Marx Brothers developed for a stage show that was never filmed anywhere else. The House That Shadows Built has never been released on DVD or Blu-ray, which seems odd to me because it feels like a clear pick for something like the Criterion Eclipse line or the Warner Archive. Catherine Barclay was played in the 1957 version by Jennifer Jones, an actress who's good when she's good, but was really out of her depth in this part. She was savaged by critics, and her next part after it actually was the role of Nicole Diver in the 1962 version of Tender as the Night, another too long, dry adaptation of an F. Scott Fitzgerald novel in which she plays a fictionalized version of Zelda Fitzgerald. So she went from playing a fictionalized version of Hemingway's First Love to a fictionalized version of Fitzgerald's Great Love, and was terrible in both of them. If you have any interest in any of this sort of stuff, it's worth reading up on Fitzgerald and Hemingway's relationship. It was a weird one. Fitzgerald discovered Hemingway. He was the one who convinced them to publish in our time. And Hemingway, who was always hyper-competitive, tended to show a lot of respect to Fitzgerald for this. He once, in 1929, there's this letter he wrote where he says he wants to be and is not yet as good as Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Fitzgerald, or Dickens. But despite that, he was never great to his friends, and Fitzgerald is no exception. If you read A Movable Feast, Hemingway's autobiography, there's a whole chapter in the end dedicated to F. Scott Fitzgerald's penis and his worries about the size of it. It's really embarrassing and kind of a mean thing to do to your friend, particularly Fitzgerald, who probably was as good, if not better, an author as Hemingway or Faulkner, but who didn't have the stamina that they did. He died in 1940. He was young, and he just couldn't do it anymore. There's a really heartbreaking interview with him near the end of his life. I think 1937. I think it was the Paris Review, where he talks about how a writer needs to have supreme confidence and strength. And he used to. And he just doesn't anymore, so he can't anymore. And his example of one who does till the end, of course, is Hemingway, who, for all his faults, that was true of him. When Hemingway was beat up by the critics and audiences after Across the River and Into the Trees, he sat down and he wrote what most consider his greatest work, The Old Man and the Sea, as a direct response to that criticism that he was washed up. Fitzgerald wasn't capable of doing anything like that. This is a really beautiful moment. This shot could be a painting by Rapine. This train whistle in the background is a good example of why this film deserved and won its Academy Award for Best Sound. That sort of looming call of the war. I'm not sure there's anything that predates it in film. It's a really lyrical, lovely moment. This is one of the moments of the film where Borzage runs past Hemingway. There's nothing quite this operatic in Hemingway's original work. But to return back to the Selznick film, to Jennifer Jones, that era of film, that late 50s to early 60s era, was particularly bad for dramas because the economics of the era were driven towards huge event films, sword and sandal films like Cleopatra or King of Kings. It's a very strong parallel to the way movies are being made now, where your whole year's slate is based around 2 or 3 different superhero films, which are very long, enormously budgeted, and have very little shelf life outside of their initial run in a movie theater because they're shot for large format screens. And like the sword and sandal films of the late 50s and early 60s, these superhero movies now are all hinging around the nostalgia of seeing live-action special effects-driven versions of characters that the audience grew up with as children.
I want a ticket to Switzerland, please.
There's a lot of people waiting to see if and when this era will come to an end, and what will come out of the rubble. A lot of people thought it was going to happen this summer with the failure of White House Down, R.I.P.D., Turbo, and so on, but it seems like we've got another couple of years in it. But anyway, enough of that. Back to 1930s, back to A Farewell to Arms. This here we have a couple of scenes in a row focusing on Catherine that, of course, have no parallel in the novel, though there's bits and pieces of them where dialogue is taken from other scenes and inserted into them. But the core of these scenes, this is the advantage of doing a film. You don't have to pick a perspective and stick with it the way you would a novel, in the sense that Hemingway was writing one. And it's a great showpiece for Helen Hayes. She's able to turn emotions on a dime. She has this 1930s voice, but her control over facial expressions feels very modern. And it's, Borzage was known for years, since 1915 or so, they said he was the best director at facial expressions, and it's an odd thing to be the best director at, but he probably was. This scene is one of my favorites in the film. I alluded to it earlier. There's no parallel to this in the novel at all, and it's a great moment. It's a great home front moment, and you don't see a lot of home front imagery in war movies, and when done well, I think it's really powerful. Here, of course, all the dialogue is not Hemingway, except for one or two lines, and you can tell pretty well off the bat that they're not Hemingway. There's what she's about to say right here.
Wallowing in luxury.
Wallowing in luxury. I mean, that is not a Hemingway phrase. He would never use that. It wouldn't be sturdy enough of a saying for him. But the dramatic irony of this and the sort of Chaplin-esque gentle comedy of optimism is foreign to Hemingway, but is an important addition to this story, because for this story to work, you need lightness in the face of the darkness. This is a sweet little moment here. It's a really nice conceit to get her to speak to him without speaking to him. And what she's saying here about how I don't live until I'm with you, that's right out of the text. But it's another moment where Catherine comes off like a crazy person in the text, and in the film she comes off frustrated. Here, this is a technique Borzage uses a lot. He hides people's faces during their strongest emotional beats. It's really it's a striking image. It lets us imprint a lot on them. He does it when Henry gets the medal from Catherine as well, and he does it a few times near the end. This is sort of the advantage of doing a film as opposed to a novel like Hemingway. Hemingway never liked to switch perspectives. He didn't hand off between characters. It was part of this very tight word-for-word control he had over his language. He never wanted to break that. With a film, you can more gracefully move from character to character. And of course, Hemingway's rival was famous for this, in particular his great masterpiece, The Sound and the Fury, which was published the same year as A Farewell to Arms. 1929 was a great year for literature, as well as Hemingway's first great novel, Faulkner's best novel. Virginia Woolf published her essay, A Room of One's Own, examining why there was no female Shakespeare. Thomas Wolfe published Look Homeward, Angel. Everybody called Thomas Wolfe the best writer of his generation, and his death was a major blow to all of these guys, Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Faulkner. And Nella Larson published her novel, Passing, which is one of the great works of race relations in American literature. And on a pulpier end, Dashiell Hammett published Red Harvest in 1929. That novel, of course, would be adapted as Yojimbo, which in turn was remade as A Fistful of Dollars with Clint Eastwood. 1932 was a hell of an interesting year for film as well. A lot of people have been suggesting now that this year, not 39, was the greatest year for classic Hollywood. It certainly was the last year you could pull off a movie like this. Between the frank sexual dialogue of this film, the ghoulishness and violence of Freaks and Island of Lost Souls, the antisocial behavior of Scarface, and the violence and frontal nudity of Cecil B. DeMille's The Sign of the Cross, 1932 was the year that spurned the strict enforcement of the production code by 34. Of course, it's no coincidence that all of those movies, with the possible exception of The Sign of the Cross, are tremendous and unforgettable films, the kind mainstream American filmmaking wouldn't see again until the mid to late 60s.
Yes, Signor Capitano. I do not like to see him lose his head.
So now we're getting to the real wartime part of the film, and it's set up very quickly. Rinaldi becomes something of a jilted lover here, striking back against Frederick for choosing Catherine over him. And Borzage handles this in his typical facially based way. I mean, Cooper says nothing and you understand what's happening. And Frederick feels a connection that spans distance and time, which is a Borzage hallmark of love. He has another film called I Will Always Love You, which is, to me, one of his definitive films. It's because you can see that he genuinely believed, or at least genuinely expressed, a belief that love was something that could conquer distance and speech. And it was kind of a melding of minds, which is not the case in the Hemingway novel, and Frederick knows and trusts immediately that there is something wrong, that he hasn't been jilted the way Nick Adams was jilted in a very short story. He's more mature than that, he's more confident. He's in Borzage love, not Hemingway love, or young Hemingway love, which was different and more of a joint stand against death. In fact, that's the one thing the romantic styles have in common. Love was a force against death. The only difference is that in Borzage, love could win. In Hemingway, it could not. It did not. When I began this, I mentioned that this film was really the work of two major artists pulling at opposite directions. But the truth is, there's also a third, Jean Negulesco, the second unit director who directed this sequence to come, this battle sequence, this montage, which is very much a throwback to the Russian silent tradition, a tradition that does not really come into play in the rest of the work. It's outside of Borzage's purview. And here we have the first truly surreal image of the film, this man dying in this expressionist doorway. Negulesco was a painter before he was a filmmaker. He was in the style of Cocteau and Picasso. In fact, his portraits, if you look at them, they're good, but they're too clearly imitations of Picasso, which is ironic because this scene is a heavy inspiration on Guernica. That moment there where Frederick Henry silently walks past the dead body face down in the mud, that's almost verbatim from the text, not of A Farewell to Arms, but of Red Badge of Courage, Stephen Crane's Civil War novel, which was a heavy inspiration on Hemingway. They say there's a straight line in American literature from Mark Twain to Stephen Crane to Hemingway, stylistically. Red Badge of Courage is about a soldier named Henry Fleming. Hemingway sort of reversed that name for his protagonist here. In the opening moments of Farewell to Arms, the concept of an army as a single unit stretched out across, as a single almost living being stretched out across a field came from Red Badge of Courage. Hemingway's most popular work, The Old Man and the Sea, is also heavily indebted to Stephen Crane. He wrote in 1899 the story The Open Boat, a true-life account of his experience in a shipwreck. I'm glad I had a chance to bring up Old Man and the Sea again, because the defining line of Old Man and the Sea is everything kills everything in some way, which I want you all to keep in your head as we come around to the last chapter of this film. We are now in a different film from the classically constructed, even-tempered, light drama which began the film. We're in a dark, angry, vibrant, surreal, silent film which pulls from the tradition of revolutionary propaganda films of the 19-teens and 20s, like Abel Gance's J'accuse or Battleship Potemkin. This image of ducks crushed under the weight of bombs is one that made its way into Guernica. Also, that first image of the man in the doorway and the focus on the faces of elderly women and tortured horses. Despite being friends with Hemingway, it seems likely Picasso never read A Farewell to Arms, though this film would have been making its way through Europe in the mid-1930s, say 1934, 1935-ish, just a few years before Picasso began work on Guernica. 1932 was maybe the first year without a major silent film. 31 had Chaplin's City Lights and F.W. Murnau's last film, Taboo. Chaplin was able to get one more silent film out, Modern Times, in 1936, but really that was the end of an era. And it was an era that a lot of these directors in the 30s and early 40s obviously were trained in. And you can see it in this entire generation of filmmaking. You can see a sort of propensity towards silence. Alfred Hitchcock, for example, straight to the end of his career, straight to The Birds and Psycho, was known for long, silent stretches of mounting visual tension. And John Ford, one of Borzagi's closest cinematic comparisons, also reveled in visual storytelling. Borzage, despite making his name in the silent era, never quite fell to that temptation. With the exception of the opening sequence of Moonrise in 48 and a gunfight in the middle of Secrets, his next film after that, his entry into the sound era was pretty complete and definitive. He never seemed to look back. This moment is the only moment like this in any of his sound era films. And of course, as I said, this sequence is not a Frank Borzage film. It is a time out from a Frank Borzage film to watch a Jean Negulesco film. So the scene ends and we're back to the Frank Borzage film with this chugging train. A sound cue that pulls me back to that heartbreaking goodbye in the hotel between the two of them. Train sort of connects them in this film. It feels like a nightmare returning to this after that sequence. And I think this image of Gary Cooper rising up with a blanket over him is meant to evoke that feeling of waking up out of some impossible nightmare. Negulesco never quite reached the heights he probably should have. From what I've seen, his best film was Deep Valley with Ida Lupina. And the film which put him on my radar, a very short adaptation of The Last Leaf in the anthology film O. Henry's Full House. He has maybe 10 minutes alongside a Henry King short, a Howard Hawks short, a Henry Hathaway short, and a Henry Coster short. And his is, I think, without question the best, though all of them are pretty good, despite the fact that the Hawks one is often called his worst film. Negulesco there, as in here, employed a lot of canted angles and close-ups of tortured faces against long shots of inclement weather and crowds. It's a very good short film, The Last Leaf. It's worth seeking out. It's along these lines stylistically. Obviously, being a O. Henry story set in Greenwich Village, it's not. You're not going to get another expressionist war piece out of it. One of the values of older film, aside from the fact that some of them like this are just exceptionally good, is that it kind of helps you explode historical myths. Two big myths about World War I are exploded by the very existence of this film, and in particular that last scene, that war montage. There's kind of a popular notion now that modern warfare, as in warfare that involves civilian death on a large scale, was an invention of the Spanish Civil War and World War II. And while it's true that those two conflicts did involve quite a few civilian deaths, it was also true of World War I, and of course wars previous, from the home front deaths in the Civil War as Sherman marched through Georgia, to the many massacres of the Plains Wars, to the Crimean, to the Mongols launching plague-ridden bodies over the walls of Kaffa, all the way back to the Aztec and Roman conquests. The tactics of modern warfare are as old as warfare itself. And to see a scene where older women, civilians, and animals are fleeing under the weight of bombs, and to see that scene in a film which predates our arbitrary Spanish Civil War deadline for modern warfare is kind of a powerful reminder that the mid-20th century did not invent large-scale murder. The other great myth is one I hear less and less, but it used to be a pretty common refrain, which is that there are no World War I films. And it's true, there are very few World War I gung-ho war movies in the way World War II lended itself so easily to them. But there are an extraordinary amount of films from the teens right up until the dawn of World War II about the First World War. It was the first major conflict that could be represented in cinematic terms. And these films, like the works of Abel Gance and like All Quiet on the Western Front, which are the first real attempts at showing war, are interesting because even down to some of the home front films like John Ford's Pilgrimage, which incidentally is one of the great World War I films and an essential text in understanding how that war damaged the world psyche. Even down to these home front films, they're shot like horror. These are techniques and traditions of framing and shadow and set construction which were created first to represent frightening horror imagery and only then employed to represent the war, which it's important to remember because it's easy to forget was a real-life, tangible fact for the people who made this. They were using horror imagery to represent something not just in history, but something that happened to them and the people they knew. And the millions of people who died in their lifetime. This is something that still happens. Godzilla was an intentional invocation of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima, and more recently Cloverfield and I Am Legend are just drowning in September 11th imagery. This was, by nature of when it was, the first time cinematic horror was converted into war imagery, but it's far from the last. And frankly, that is just how World War I looked, but it's a crucial psychological image, one which characterized the 1930s, a decade where the world was still reeling from the loss of an entire generation of young men, while also embroiled in some of the worst environmental disasters in human history and economic and social crises where the entire concept of organized society seemed to be ready to crumble. This is something that comes up again in the 60s and into the 70s, which is why these films, of which this, for all that bluster, is actually one of the least aggressive and least angry of them. But these World War I films, they look, if anything, like the counterculture films of the Vietnam era. Things like In the Year of the Pig or Ice, which show war and the political machinations behind it as profane act that needs to be actively stopped. So when you think back to this 90s, early 2000s view that there were no World War I films, it really was a statement that there was no room in the psychological marketplace of the 90s for World War I films. It's anecdotal, but it seems to me, in the wake of the past decade and all the horrors it's brought, these films of the 1930s have become more popular than the films of the 40s,
I am not a good egg.
with their optimism and pride. The pendulum has sort of swung back, and the conversation seems to have come back to films like this, and Four Sons, and Westfront 1918, and Journey's End, films weary of fighting, not enamored with it. Even this conceit of heroically fleeing the battle is something that's only appropriate in political waves. Of course, Frederick doesn't know what's happened to Catherine yet. Catherine collapsed in the face of the letters censored and returned back to her, just the same way that Frederick finally faces and abandons the war in the face of that same transgression. The great sin of war in this movie isn't so much death, which, as we can see right now, comes in peacetime as well. It's distance. Now, like I said, in Old Man and the Sea, Hemingway put forth his philosophy, which is everything kills everything else in some way. Later in the same story, there's the phrase, "I love you and respect you very much, but I will kill you dead before this day ends." And that seems to me what has happened to Catherine here. Her love for Frederick and the baby Frederick put in her is killing her. She's sacrificed by love. To Hemingway, this is grotesque. This is the sad, ironic payoff of the temerity of being happy during a war. To Borzage, it seems like something else. It seems more like the sacrifice of a saint, a martyr. Catherine, we first meet in this film, showing compassion to a woman who's also stigmatized and on her own after pregnancy by a soldier. Catherine has no Catherine to comfort her in this pain. She has only her strength and her conviction, her almost holy conviction that Frederick is coming, which of course he is. Their love for each other is... If Hemingway's is perfunctory, theirs is the opposite. Theirs is almost holy. She's essentially a saint, and he is her God, and he is essentially a penitent, and she is his God. Just like Hemingway said, everything kills everything else in some way, Borzage in the opening text to Street Angel puts forth his dictum, which is everywhere, in every town, in every street we pass unknowing, human souls made great through love and adversity. This is greatness in the making for Borzage. And he perhaps fumbles it a little bit. There's a bit too much dialogue as death draws near. There's a bit too much softball in this to make sure we understand the philosophical point. Borzage was a Catholic, a practicing long-time Catholic. Hemingway was an atheist who became a Catholic after marrying the woman who's his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, whose hard labor inspired this scene, in fact. He became a Catholic in practice, not in belief, but he always had a deep respect for the weight of the church. Borzage's intuitive understanding of holiness and the concept of
Not yet.
love lasting beyond death slams ultimately up against Hemingway's belief that love cannot stand up to war, cannot stand up to anything. Borzage's final film was The Big Fisherman about St. Paul. Hemingway's final work published was The Dangerous Summer, about bullfighters, and about how, in the end, the only noble action we have is facing death proudly, because there's nothing else and nothing else we can do. This is one of my favorite little moments in the film. It's such an odd, small touch. It's in the novel as well, but it's about the only part of a large section that remains, and it's such a nice, small way to drag Frederick back into society for an instant. The censors wanted Catherine to live. Of course, she doesn't. And it's a good thing she doesn't, because this story would be meaningless if she lived. There were famously 48 different endings for this story. One of them, the only one that Hemingway had any regrets about removing, went like this. Catherine was unconscious all the time, and it did not take her very long to die. There are a great many more details, starting with my first meeting with an undertaker and all the business of burial in a foreign country and going on with the rest of my life, which has gone on and seems likely to go on for a long time. I could tell how Rinaldi was cured of the syphilis and lived to find that technique learned in wartime surgery is not of much practical use in peace. I could tell how the priest in our mess lived to be a priest in Italy under fascism. I could tell how Ettore became a fascist and the part he took in that organization. I could tell how Piani got to be a taxi driver in New York, and what sort of a singer Simmons became. Many things have happened. Everything blunts and the world keeps on. It never stops. It only stops for you. Some of it stops while you are alive. The rest goes on, and you go on with it. I could tell you what I have done since March 1918, when I walked that night in the rain back to the hotel where Catherine and I had lived, and went upstairs to our room and undressed and slept finally because I was so tired. To wake in the morning with the sun shining in the window, then suddenly to realize what had happened. I could tell what has happened since then, but that is the end of the story. Even in Hemingway's most optimistic ending, that unpublished one, the story ends with her death. This is about a love that cannot continue beyond the bounds it began in. And Catherine, of all people, knew that. The story she tells near the beginning of hoping her first love will come to her in the hospital with some minor leg injury from a saber wound or something is precisely what happens with Frederick and what incites this love. It was a fantasy love from the beginning. It was a love based on this schoolgirl passion from this girl on the rebound. But like a lot of these wistful romance movies, there's the question, is that such a bad thing? Is a summer love something, as the censors and Ferguson would have it, something shameful and childish? Or is it something, as Borzage would have it, something restorative? Catherine would be alive without Frederick, but she would be,
Don't you see?
a loveless shell pining over the dead. Of course, that's what Frederick now is, which seems maybe a reason why Borzage would soften the blow with this simultaneous gift of peace. Something good that seems to somehow obscurely, innately emanate from the death of Catherine in this film. It's too tight and too small and too focused on the romance for that to mean anything else, I think. This is a small, wonderful Borzage detail. As we careen towards the finish, he takes time to show not just Catherine, but these nurses and the sympathy they have for each other. Borzage's humanism has put him on the outs for much of film history.
You can go in now.
Andrew Sarris kind of nailed it when he said that his romanticism, people have a tendency to mistrust it, to think that it came from studio-imposed guidelines, but in fact it was the opposite. Borzage's talent and passion for this kind of story is the reason this kind of story became so popular in this era.
You're all right.
Some have said he was the wrong choice to direct this film. He probably was. And that's why this film is so powerful.
Found where you were.
Poor darling. Let me look at you.
At the end here, we're watching two endings. Hemingway's, where this ending is crushing, and the end of a life, the end of a story of a life, even though it went on and on, as he says in that ending. And Borzage's ending, where this is the beginning
You're going to be all right, Cat.
of an eternal life of peace. In a moment, you'll see when she finally collapses,
You want me to do anything, Cat?
the image of a train whistle and church bells indicating the beginnings of the peace ceremony.
Tell me you haven't stopped loving me.
Like I said, censors for a long time fought over the issue of when, if ever, they were married.
I'll never stop loving you.
They, of course, were not married yet, even though the priest gave them that ceremony. They're not married. They become, in this film, married. In this moment, in the moment of her death. Frank Borzage was one of the first to make anti-Nazi films, one of the first to use his art against their horrible anti-humanist tidal wave. He was one of the first, alongside Douglas Sirk and William Wellman, and of course Dorothy Arzner, to treat women as complex and strong human beings. Hemingway was one of the first to capture the potential of the single moment, the single sentence. One of the first to understand the ultimately very cinematic imperative of a close, narrow focus, and the way the background of something vast, like the Great War, is to a man only the story of one life lived as bravely and honestly as possible. This is something Borzage took to heart. This short film narrows the focus so deeply that in that one paragraph I read from the alternate ending, only Rinaldi and the priest are recognizable characters in this film, and both are far more ancillary here. For all his anger and cynicism, he concedes in a Paris Review interview that the best writing is when you are in love.
Don't let me go.
He was still in love with Agnes von Kurowski here.
I don't want to leave you anymore.
And this is his love poem to her. Frank Borzage was still in love with his wife here, a woman whose abortion haunted him, who was denied children just as Frederick is denied children, and who was denied love beyond this moment, just as Frederick was denied love beyond this moment. But Borzage never gave in to cynicism. If you like this film, which I hope you did, I really recommend you check out some more Frank Borzage stuff. Of his works, I really like Lazy Bones, which was his first film for Fox in 1925. Little Man, What Now, a 1934 film, which was among the first to anticipate the horrors of Nazism. He also has a 1916 Western called The Pilgrim, which I think is really stunning and has a lot of the same themes as this film, which I recorded a commentary for a few months ago. The train whistle which connects them through this film, or a refrain through this film connecting the two of them, and the church bells which are shot like wedding bells, and the dove of peace, her death in the moment of the peace ceremony, is their wedding ceremony, and her wedding gift, in a way, to the world. And here Frederick stands with this combination funeral shroud, bedsheet, wedding dress, carrying her over the altar and offering her as a sacrifice to the God of peace. And here at the end is another example of Borzage's trademark of shooting people from behind during scenes of great emotion. Though a much larger, more bombastic, almost Sirkian version. It's an unsubtle ending, but one that I think was earned, and for the most part an effective way to end this hybrid therapy session, battle cry to peace. Once again, I'm John D'Amico. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. For more of my film criticism, go to www.shotcontext.com. And if you have any questions or comments or input about this, please feel free to leave a comment or email me. Let me know what you think about this remarkable film.